The smell told them first. That is the detail the lead investigator would return to in every subsequent account of that morning. Not the crowbar, not the gap in the subfloor, not the call that had brought them to a derelict farmhouse on the eastern edge of Denton County, Texas in the first place, but the smell that rose from the floor the moment the boards gave. It was March 3rd, 2022, in the farming community of Crum. Population 4,900, where the land runs flat and pale toward the horizon in every direction, and the houses that sit on it have a way of keeping their business. The property at 1140 Creekside Road had been vacant for 11 years. The county had condemned it in 2019 after a structural assessment and had scheduled demolition for the spring of 2022. The crew sent to begin the clearance that Thursday morning had pulled 2 boards from the living room subfloor to assess the joist conditions before the heavy equipment arrived. The first board came up clean. The second board caught on something below the subfloor, something that had no business being there in the cavity between the joists. And when the crew chief knelt down and shone his light into the gap, and then stood up and stepped back and called 911 without explaining why, the dispatcher heard enough in his voice to send 2 units without asking for details. Detective Sergeant Nina Voss of the Denton County Sheriff's Office arrived at Creekside Road at 9:47 that morning. She stepped through the front door. She understood, before she reached the living room, what she was walking toward, what she could not yet understand, what would take 3 more months, 2 DNA matches, and the unraveling of a secret that had been load-bearing inside 3 separate families for 31 years, was how many people had been destroyed by what was under that floor. But to know that, you have to go back to 1991. You have to go back to the Creekside Roadhouse when it was still a home. And you have to understand, first, who had lived there and what had been broken long before anything was hidden. Denton County in 1991 was Texas farmland in the specific transitional moment before the suburbs arrived and changed its character permanently. Still mostly agricultural in its eastern reaches, still organized around the rhythms of small-town life, with communities like Crum maintaining the kind of social density where a family's history was common knowledge, and a newcomer was still a newcomer after 5 years. The land around Creekside Road was flat black clay soil, good for hay and sorghum, and the houses along it were spaced far enough apart to ensure that what happened inside one of them was largely invisible to the others. Roy and Sandra Pruitt had lived at 1140 Creekside Road since 1979. Roy ran a small excavation company out of a metal equipment shed behind the house. Grading work, pond digging, rural utility trenching, the kind of labor that kept him outdoors in all weather, and left him with the particular physical solidity of a man who had spent 3 decades moving earth. Sandra managed the household and worked 3 days a week at the feed supply store on Crum's main street, where she was known as someone who remembered the preferences of every regular customer and who kept a jar of hard candy on the counter for the children who came in with their parents on Saturdays. They had 2 daughters, Tammy, who was 23 in 1991 and lived in Denton, and Gail, who was 19 and still at home, enrolled in the fall semester at North Central Texas College. Roy Pruitt was 51 years old in 1991 and was, in the outward appearance of his life, a man whose edges were weathered but whose foundations were solid. He coached youth baseball in Crum for 11 years. He was a member of the volunteer fire department for 9. He sat on the county road advisory board. He was the man neighbors called when a tractor needed jumping in a wet field or a fence line needed another body for an afternoon. He was the kind of man that small agricultural communities produce with some regularity and depend on in specific, practical ways. And he was known across Denton County's Eastern District in the uncomplicated way of people who show up when showing up is what's needed. What the county did not know, and what Sandra Pruitt did not fully know, and what their daughters understood only in the fragmented, protective way that children in troubled houses understand things that have never been named aloud, was that Roy Pruitt had a separate life that ran parallel to the visible one. It was not a secret in the dramatic sense. It was a pattern of absences that were always plausibly explained, of moods that had a predictable shape, of a control over the household's information that was so consistent it had long since become the air inside the house, rather than a thing anyone noticed separately. The third family enters here. In the spring of 1989, a woman named Diane Kohler moved to Crum from Wichita Falls with her son Marcus, who was 9 years old, and took a rental house on the north edge of town. She had left a marriage in Wichita Falls that had not been good, and she had come to Crum because her sister lived there and because Crum was the right distance from the life she was leaving. She found work at the feed supply store, which is where she met Sandra Pruitt, who trained her on the register and remembered her coffee order from the second day, and who became, over the following 2 years, one of the closest friends she had ever had. She did not know, in those 2 years, that she had also become someone else entirely to Roy Pruitt. Roy had been attentive to Diane from the first time Sandra brought her to the house for dinner in the spring of 1989. He was attentive in the way of men who have learned to be attentive without appearing to be anything other than neighborly. And Diane, who had spent 3 years in a marriage that had taught her to read male attention as threat, had read him correctly from the beginning and kept her distance with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has learned how. She told her sister. She did not tell Sandra. In the late summer of 1991, Diane Kohler vanished from Crum, Texas. She was 34 years old. Her son Marcus, now 11, was sent to live with Diane's sister in Wichita Falls. Her rental house was cleared by the landlord 6 weeks later. And because she had left a marriage in another city and had no deep roots in Crum and had told people in the weeks before she disappeared that she was thinking about moving back to Wichita Falls, her absence was processed by the community and by the Crum police as a departure rather than a disappearance. Nobody filed a missing persons report for 11 days. By the time the Denton County Sheriff's Office logged the case, the trail was cold in the specific way that trails go cold when the initial framing is wrong, not frozen, but misread from the start. The case was assigned to Detective Corporal James Whitfield of the Denton County Sheriff's Office, a 40-year-old investigator who had worked missing persons for 6 years and who had the useful professional habit of treating the stated explanation for an absence as a hypothesis rather than a conclusion. He interviewed Diane's sister in Wichita Falls, who was certain her sister had not returned voluntarily. She had spoken to Diane by phone on August 14th, and Diane had said nothing about leaving, and Diane had never gone anywhere without telling her first. He interviewed Diane's neighbors in Crum. He interviewed her co-workers at the feed supply store. He interviewed Sandra Pruitt, who was visibly distressed and who said that the last time she had seen Diane was the morning of August 16th, when Diane had dropped Marcus at Sandra's house while she ran an errand. Diane had said she would be back in an hour. She was never back. Whitfield asked Sandra about Roy. Sandra said Roy had been at a job site in Gainesville on August 16th. She had the invoice. She produced it. The invoice covered the morning. It did not cover the afternoon. Whitfield noted this in his file. He noted that Roy Pruitt was the last person whose alibi was incomplete for the relevant time frame. He noted that Diane Kohler's departure from a troubled marriage made voluntary departure a plausible surface reading of her absence. He noted that the 11-day delay in reporting had cost him the window in which the Creekside Road property could have been searched as a matter of routine. He filed a follow-up request with the department to have the Pruitt property included in a secondary canvass. The request was approved and then deprioritized when a multiple vehicle accident in the county's South District pulled the available investigative resources for the remainder of that week. The canvass was never conducted. Whitfield returned to it twice over the following 2 months and was told each time that it was on the schedule. It never happened. He noted this in his file too. He continued noting things in his file for 3 more years, until the case was reclassified as inactive in 1994 and the file went into storage. He retired from the sheriff's office in 2007. He kept a photocopy of the original case summary in a folder in his home office in Denton. Every year or two, he took it out and read it. The invoice gap, morning covered, afternoon not, was the thing he always came back to. Meanwhile, in the house on Creekside Road, Sandra Pruitt was living with what she knew and did not know, which is the particular geography of a woman whose closest friend has disappeared and whose husband cannot account for part of the day she disappeared in. Sandra did not go to the police. She did not go to the police in 1991 or 1992, or in any of the years that followed. She went quiet in the specific way of people who have looked at a truth and decided that knowing it fully would cost them more than they are able to pay. She continued working at the feed supply store. She continued her marriage. She asked Roy once about August 16th, and he told her the afternoon had been a different job that hadn't made it onto the invoice because the client had paid cash. She did not ask again. Tammy and Gail Pruitt grew up in that silence. Gail finished her degree and moved to Fort Worth. Tammy had 2 children and stayed in Denton. Neither of them spoke about Diane Kohler in the years after her disappearance with any frequency or directness, because the house on Creekside Road had established, without announcement, that the subject was not one that opened well. Roy Pruitt died of a cardiac event in March of 2011. He was 71 years old. Sandra sold the Creekside Road property that fall to a buyer who used it as a rental for several years before the maintenance debt accumulated beyond what the rental income could service. By 2019, the county condemned it. By 2022, the demolition crew arrived. By 2003, 12 years after Diane vanished, Marcus Kohler was 23 years old and living in Wichita Falls, and had grown up with the specific damage of a child whose parent disappears without explanation and whose community's working theory of that disappearance. She went back to Wichita Falls. She wanted a fresh start. She just left. Had always conflicted with everything he knew about his mother, which was that she would not have left him. He had filed his own requests with the Denton County Cold Case Line beginning in 2004, when he was 24. He had submitted a DNA reference sample to NamUs in 2011 during an enrollment outreach he learned about through a missing persons advocacy group in Dallas. He had received no result. He continued calling. By 2011, Sandra Pruitt was a widow. She moved from Creekside Road to Denton to be closer to Tammy. She took almost nothing from the house, because almost nothing from the house was something she wanted to carry. She left the furniture. She left the kitchen appliances. She left, in the living room, a floor she had been careful not to look at directly for 20 years. By 2016, 25 years had passed, and the Creekside Roadhouse had been empty for 5 years, and the feed supply store had been sold to a chain, and the last traces of Diane Kohler's daily life in Crum had dissolved into the kind of absence that small towns process eventually, by simply moving the furniture of memory around until the gap is no longer the first thing you notice. Marcus Kohler called the Cold Case Line in 2016. He called it in 2018. He called it in 2020. He was told each time that the case was on the review list. Then the demolition crew arrived in March of 2022. Then the second board came up. Then Nina Voss walked through the front door of the Creekside Roadhouse and understood, before she reached the living room, what she was walking toward. Every case on this channel takes weeks of careful research. Tracing records, locating the documents nobody was meant to find, following the threads that were buried rather than cut. If that work matters to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read everyone. Now, let's go back to what was under that floor. The remains recovered from the subfloor cavity at 1140 Creekside Road were submitted to the Tarrant County Medical Examiner's Forensic Laboratory on March 4, 2022. The cavity was approximately 18 inches deep between the joists and the concrete pier foundation, accessed by the removal of 5 adjacent floorboards across a section of the living room. The remains had been in the cavity for an estimated 25 to 35 years, consistent with the time frame of Diane Kohler's disappearance in 1991. A biological reference sample from Marcus Kohler, on file with NAMUS since 2011, was cross-referenced against the recovered material. The mitochondrial DNA match came back on March 22, 2022, 19 days after the discovery. Conclusive. It was Diane. Nina Voss called Marcus Kohler at his home in Wichita Falls on the morning of March 23rd. He was 42 years old. He had been waiting for this call in some form for 31 years. She told him what the lab had confirmed. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My mother didn't leave me. I always knew she didn't leave me." He said it with the flatness of a fact that has been true for 31 years and has simply been waiting to be confirmed by the world. The investigation that followed moved on 2 tracks simultaneously. The first track was building the physical case, establishing the connection between Roy Pruitt, the Creekside Road subfloor, and Diane Kohler's remains. Roy Pruitt was 11 years dead, which meant there would be no arrest, no trial, no sentence. What there would be was a record, and building that record required the same evidentiary standard as a prosecution. Voss worked backward through Roy's financial records, his equipment logs, his job site invoices, and found, in the invoicing archive maintained by the County Road Board from Roy's contract work, a pattern of documented afternoon gaps in August 1991 that the original investigation had never obtained because the county records request had not been among the documentation gathered before the canvas was deprioritized. The second track was harder. It involved the people still living. Sandra Pruitt was 79 years old. She was living in an assisted living facility in Denton. Voss and a Denton County prosecutor drove to see her on April 14, 2022. Sandra was seated in the common room when they arrived, and she watched them come through the door with an expression that Voss later described as recognition, not surprise, but the specific look of a person who has been waiting for a door to open and is not shocked that it finally has, only that it has taken this long. Sandra Pruitt gave a full voluntary statement. It took 4 hours. In it, she confirmed what she had known and when she had known it, which was not immediately and not fully, but which had accumulated in the years after Diane vanished into a certainty she had never spoken aloud. She described the afternoon of August 16th and what Roy had told her and what she had seen in the days afterward that she had chosen to interpret in ways that allowed her to remain in her life. She described 20 years of sleeping in a house above a floor she had learned not to look at, and the specific texture of living with a truth that has been built into the walls of every ordinary day. She was not charged. The prosecutor reviewed her statement and the circumstances and determined that the knowing, however devastating in its own right, did not meet the statutory threshold for criminal liability. Tammy and Gail Pruitt learned what their father had done from their mother, not from investigators, because Sandra had asked for that, and Voss had agreed it was the right sequence. Gail was in Fort Worth. She drove to Denton when she heard. She sat with her mother for 2 days without speaking much, and then drove home and did not speak publicly about any of it for the remainder of the year. Tammy, in Denton, had the harder geography, closer to both her mother and to the place where the house had stood and where she had grown up and where every childhood memory now wore a different light than it had the week before. She said, in a single statement provided through an attorney in the fall of 2022, "My father is not here to answer for this. My mother is. My sister and I are. We don't know yet what that means. We're trying to find out." The Denton County Sheriff's Office formally closed the Diane Kohler case on September 1st, 2022, with a determination of homicide, perpetrator identified as Roy Allen Pruitt, deceased, and a full case summary entered into the permanent record. James Whitfield, 81 years old and living in retirement in Denton, received a courtesy call from Voss on the day the case closed. She told him about the invoice gap. She told him he had been right about the afternoon in 1991. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I needed a week. I had 2 months and I couldn't get the canvas done." He did not say anything after that for a while, and Voss let the silence hold, because it deserved to. Diane Kohler was 34 years old. She had driven 2 hours from a marriage that had not been good, because her sister lived in Crum and because the right distance from the wrong life is its own form of courage. She had a son who was 9 years old when she arrived, and 11 years old when she disappeared, and who grew up in the specific absence of a parent, who did not leave voluntarily, and who spent 31 years calling a cold case line twice a year, because the alternative, accepting the community's working theory, which was that she had simply gone, was something he could not do, and would not do, and did not do. Marcus Kohler is 42 years old. He has a daughter of his own who is 7. He has a mother who has a name now, and a record that says clearly what happened to her and who made it happen. He has not said publicly whether that is enough. It is not a question with a clean answer, and he is the only person qualified to work toward one. Sandra Pruitt is 80 years old. She spent 20 years in a house with a floor that held a truth she had been careful not to look at directly. And she has now given a 4-hour statement naming every part of what she knew and when she knew it. And she lives with that accounting the way she lives with everything else about the years on Creekside Road. Carefully, one day at a time, with the knowledge that there is no version of her life that does not contain all of it. Her daughters are doing the same work in their own ways and on their own timelines. And the specific damage of loving a person who turned out to be capable of this particular thing is not a damage that resolves on any timetable that the legal calendar can set. What does it say about the weight that a floor can hold? Not the physical weight, but the moral one. That 3 families spent 31 years organized, in their different ways, around a secret that was buried under 12 feet of living room. What do we owe to the James Whitfields of the world, who document the gaps they couldn't close and retire with the file in a folder and take the courtesy call 30 years later because they need to know whether the thing they couldn't finish was finally finished? And what does Marcus Kohler's 31 years of twice-annual phone calls say about the kind of faith that persists not because it is rewarded, but because the only alternative is abandonment? And abandonment was never available to him. Justice came for Diane Kohler after 31 years. Stories like hers remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if you want more solved cold cases, the links are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.